very much. Welcome, everybody, both members of the community, students and faculty and friends, and particularly students from my classes, History 216, Byzantine Thought and Civilization, and History 706, Museum Studies. What I'm going to do first is upload my PowerPoint. If I can do that, let me just do share screen. There we go. I hope everyone can see this. And there we have our title page, as it were. So, as I said, welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a recent research project which I recently published as an academic article, which concerns what we call material culture, objects from the Byzantine period, the medieval Byzantine period. The title of my talk is Toasting the Defeat of the Barbarians, ? A Byzantine Material Culture Mystery. Now, the meaning of my title will become obvious in the course of my talk, so just bear it in mind, because I am going to be exploring a Byzantine material culture mystery. The way I'm going to give my talk is, while I'm obviously going to be telling you what my interpretation of these particular objects are, at the same time, I'm going to be explaining it in the form of, shall we say, a research journey or an intellectual journey. I thought this would be appealing to the audience, especially to our students, to understand, as it were, the research process and the intellectual thought process by which we arrive at our conclusions in the course of academic research. So it's a bit Sherlock Holmesian in the sense that we're following the breadcrumbs, and certainly in the course of research, and this is, I'm sure my colleagues would agree, that although we plan our research projects and try to work out in what directions develop hypotheses about the things we are researching, sometimes we can't predict in the directions in which our research will take us. So this journey, which I embarked upon, proved to be an interesting, intriguing, and meandering course, which led me to my conclusions. Just to state what my conclusions are, before we get there, I'm going to be discussing with you two ceramic drinking bowls, what I identify as drinking bowls. That is bowl-shaped vessels for drinking, which were excavated in modern Istanbul, which is the former East Roman or Byzantine capital of Constantinople. And these bowls can be dated to the first half of the 7th century. Now, these bowls, as we'll see, are very unusual in terms of their shape and decoration, and they bear on them, as you see from the illustration on the poster on the screen, representations of human faces. Now, this is very unusual for Byzantine ceramics and art, and my research led me to identify these as outsiders to the Byzantine world. It doesn't really conform to Byzantine notions of, shall we say, artistic idioms, artistic beauty, and that these were representations of outsiders to Byzantine society, and that these images are stereotypical images. My research led me to argue that these images, in fact, are meant to represent a people called the Avars, the Avars. These were a nomadic people of the Eurasian steppe. who were characterized by the Byzantines, because they lay beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire, as barbarians, which is a very negative term in Roman and Byzantine ethnography. So what I'm going to be discussing today is how these vessels, in combination with other sources, historical, scientific, shed light on the Byzantine cultural construction of the Avar barbarian, what these cups were, I believe, used for and who used them, and how this sheds light on the historical events in 7th century Constantinople. So, these cups, I first came across these cups while visiting exhibitions in Istanbul way back in 2007. In the year 2007, there was a momentous exhibition in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, which showed the findings of the spectacular excavations then going on in Istanbul at the underground metro excavations in the city. In the early 2000s, a major subway network was being constructed in Istanbul, and the most important and largest excavation took place at a site called Yeni Kapı in Turkish. Now, this site, which is marked on this map of Constantinople, Byzantine Constantinople, which you see here on the slide, this in Byzantine times was an ancient harbor. It was the harbor of Theodosius, and it was one of the most important harbors in the Byzantine city. So excavations there, and you can see illustrations of the exhibition catalogs and even popular publications on this slide, showcased the spectacular findings from this site. Now, one of the most intriguing objects that I saw were these. These are the drinking bowls, which are the subject of my talk today, and eventually became the subject of the academic journal article which I published. These two bowls, cups, drinking bowls, were discovered in the Yeni Kapı excavations, and I think you can see they're very distinctive. They have a rounded base. They have a single handle attached to their side. And you can see that this is showing the underside of these vessels, the rounded underside. You can see that they have this molded face, these faces. This is one of the two bowls, and this is the second. But they are finished in very different ways. One is glazed, as you see on the left, and one has what we call red slip over it, as we see on the right. So these were the bowls that caught my attention as being extremely unusual, and certainly I hadn't seen anything like them before. So let's say a few words about archaeology and how it operates as a discipline, and understand its intersection with other fields like history, for example. So I'm going to be a bit professorial at this moment, because it's important to understand that this research and the research that I do combines the study of history and archaeology, but it also touches on many other fields of inquiry. And you can see this illustrated in this schematic. Do you see that archaeology here is at the center? And you can see in the surrounding circles the various disciplines which intersect with archaeology. So if you do archaeology, and Byzantine archaeology, which I do, can be called a historical archaeology because it deals with a period that has historical records, there's a lot of things to take account of, as you can see here. In the course of my research, as you can see, I had in this talk, you'll see that my research took me to a number of the circles that you see intersecting with archaeology, not just historical sources, but also art history, also other scientific areas such as the study of human remains, um, also anthropology, and understanding ethnography as well. So what lies at the center of archaeology is what we call the study of material culture. Remember, this talk is called A Byzantine Material Culture Mystery. So what is material culture for those of you who aren't familiar with this term? Well, material culture, as it is explained in this quotation on the screen, is just what it says it is. It is the manifestations of culture through material productions. And therefore, the study of material culture is the study of material to understand culture, to discover the beliefs, values, ideas, attitudes, and assumptions of a particular community or society at a given time. The underlying premise is that human-made objects reflect, consciously or unconsciously, directly or indirectly, the beliefs of the individuals who commissioned, fabricated, purchased, or used them, and by extension, the beliefs of the larger society to which these individuals belonged. Thus, material culture is an object-based branch of cultural anthropology or cultural history. And because obviously archaeology deals with objects or artifacts from the past, these artifacts therefore shed light on specific historical eras or periods or even historical moments. And as you'll see from later in my talk, this is important. So that's really at the core of my method, the study of these objects, which represent a human culture. And in this case, the culture of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, in the 7th century CE. Now, the way that we study artifacts or material culture is illustrated in this diagram. You must realize that many objects in material culture are not described necessarily or referred to in historical written sources. They are, as it were, mute testaments to the historical archaeological past. So therefore, archaeologists have developed a methodology by which we can get the mute artifacts to speak. And this helpful diagram shows us how it is done. At the center, you see the artifact or visual source. What can we see? So the first step really in the analysis of material culture of any object is really to observe it, to study it in the scientific methodological way, and to ask questions of it that can give us answers. So how was it made? Who made it? Why was it made? When was it made? And of course, how did it function? What does it mean? And this therefore leads us from this inner ring of questions to bigger questions which touch on society. And that's exactly the methodology that I apply in my research and which I apply to these cups. So let's see where my research took me and where the clues took me as regards my interpretation of these drinking bowls. So here are the two drinking bowls that were excavated in the excavations at Yenikapı, the former harbor of Theodosius at Istanbul. So the first step I did while looking at these things was obviously to try and forensically study them as objects in the method I've just described. to study them as objects and to ask questions of them that can elucidate what they are, how they were made, who made them, and what their function was. Now, as you can see, the shape of these objects is fairly distinctive, and this proved important. They are literally in the form of rounded bottomed bowls. The bottoms of these have rounded concave shapes. They have attached to their rims circular handles like you see here, and the underside of their bowls have these impressed faces, human faces, which you see here. You can also see that the two vessels, which are somewhat fragmentary, certainly the one on the right, have different techniques of being finished. This one on the right has what we call a red slip over its exterior, and the one on the left has a lead-based glaze, a yellowish green glaze, which looks rather blackish on its exterior. But it is the faces that in particular draw our eye. Notice, for example, that these faces are obviously they're on a circular concave surface, but they look rather moon-like. They also have these distinctive almond-shaped eyes, which are slightly inclined. They have these short, stubby noses. They have these full lips. They have these rounded cheeks. They have this long hair, which you can see well on this one on the left and on the right, hanging down the sides of the faces. And they seem to be wearing some kind of cap or bonnet. On the one on the right, you see it looks a bit like some kind of cap or some kind of hat. On the left, you can see there's a V-shaped projection of some kind of headgear on this particular head. And these are important too, as we shall see. These are clues that I followed up. So these are very remarkable and unusual faces. And here's a detail of the one of the bowls, showing you details of the physiognomy, the face on this bowl. Now, first of all, I dipped into the method of making of these objects. This particular example that you see on the screen has what we call a red slip finish, as you can see. Now, this linked it to contemporary pottery that was being made in the Eastern Roman Empire and in Constantinople, examples of which you see illustrated on the screen. This type of red slipped tableware, as we call it, was very, very common in the early Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And this style of pottery continued through the 6th and through the 7th century. It gradually came to an end in the late 7th century. So it was common in the 6th and 7th centuries, which we'll see is important to us. And it clearly links the bowl that we see here with this class of pottery. So this helped me to narrow down the date of this particular vessel. There was an approximate date of the 7th to 8th century provided by the excavators, but this enabled me to narrow it down. It belongs to this red slip type pottery group, which can be no later in date than the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. The other bowl is glazed, as you see here, and its fabric, the clay, is very distinctive. It has this whitish fabric. This enabled me to link it with another type of pottery that was common in the early 7th century into the 8th century. And this is what we call glazed whiteware 1 production. This was made in the region of Constantinople and in Constantinople, starting in the very end of the 6th, early 7th century. And you can see some examples here to compare on the slide. So this again helped narrow down the date. So from the manufacturing technique, the glaze, etc., and the find spot in the harbour of Theodosius, I was able to narrow down that these two cups are roughly contemporary and that they probably belong in the first half of the 7th century CE. Now, I discovered another object which is comparable with these vessels. And this is an object that is now in the Dumbarton Oaks collection in Washington, D.C. This is a silver object, and it can be identified as another example of a drinking bowl. It has a similar shape, it has a single handle, and interestingly enough, it has a similar face, as you can see, on the underside of this silver vessel. So you see the same distinctive eyes, nose, and mouth, in this case with a moustache, and with this stylized hair hanging down either side. So clearly there's more to these vessels and more of these vessels than we currently know. Now, the study of this silver drinking cup that you see here, which took place in the 1960s, suggested that this face, which we see here, could be the face of a person from Central Asia, largely based on the assumption that this artistic representation was true to the physical physiognomy, the physical facial characteristics of people from Central Asia, Eastern Asia. Now, while it seems a reasonable hypothesis, we have to be very careful with the ancient representation of peoples and what we might call ethnic characteristics in Greek and Roman art. We can't just take it for granted that this necessarily shows someone from Central or Eastern Asia. We have to carefully consider how the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, their predecessors, represented people in art. The way they represented themselves and other peoples in art was very much dependent on their cultural attitudes to themselves and to these peoples. Very often representing them in the form of stereotypes. So, for example, in Greek and Roman art, drew upon the classical tradition and tended to represent the human body and the human face in a very idealized and slightly stylized way. It tended to emphasize, as this slide shows you, the Greek and Roman idea of what they considered to be beauty. You must realize that the concept of beauty is a human construction. It's a cultural construction, and different civilizations through time have had differing ideas of what they consider to be beautiful. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as they say. So for the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this is true also of the Byzantines, this style of art, such as you see here, was considered to be perfection. It was the beautiful in their eyes. When they came to represent outsiders, peoples that they called barbarians, which is a negative term, Greeks and Romans tended to represent outsiders, people who lay beyond the boundaries of their civilizations and empires. They tended to represent them in stereotypical and, in their eyes, negative ways. So, for example, here we see representations of Romans triumphing over barbarians, and they are marked as barbarians not so much by their facial characteristics, but rather by, shall we say, their dress, by their hair, such as these long beards and hair, their dress in the form of trousers, and also by their slightly tortured expressions. But they didn't choose to represent them, shall we say, in an ethnographic way, representing their facial characteristics. They tended to be represented in a way that they would recognize themselves. We see this also in late antique art, as you see here. Eastern and northern peoples who lived in the steppe regions of what is now Ukraine and Central Asia. These peoples were regarded by the Romans, the Byzantines, as barbarians because they lay in these outside of the empire, and because these peoples were nomadic peoples. This for them was a sign of their barbarism. And they tended to, again, to be characterized in negative representations, negative terms, by their clothes, by their attributes in art, by their facial hair, but not necessarily by their facial physiognomy, the actual features of their faces. Here's another example from the Great Palace showing a barbarian face, but you'll see this face does not resemble the bowls that we are talking about. So the bowls then have a very different, markedly different physiognomy or facial features than these traditional stereotypical representations of barbarians. And that alone would have, in Byzantine eyes, have made these representations of outsiders. They do not resemble the beautiful classical faces we have seen before. They're very definitely foreigners, outsiders, and therefore barbarians. So the question is, who do these bowls represent? Now, this led me on a research journey following the breadcrumbs to the regions of the nomadic steppe regions, modern-day Ukraine and Central Asia. You see Kazakhstan, Samarkand. And this map shows connections to these regions, particularly to the region known as Sogdiana in ancient times. This was in the region of Samarkand, which you see on the map. And you can see that this region had connections to the Byzantine Empire through various trade routes. Now, there were cultural connections and even diplomatic connections between these regions, these distant eastern regions, and the Byzantine Empire. You can see on these coins, for example, that they even imitated Byzantine imperial coins. Here you have an authentic Byzantine coin of Heraclius, and above it you have an imitation, which was created in Sogdia. So there was, as it were, a certain amount of cultural exchange going on between these regions. What's interesting about Sogdian art is that it does represent human faces with a physiognomy which does resemble or is similar to those found on the bowl cups, the drinking bowls that you see here. These are wall paintings, as you see, from Tajikistan, which date to the same period as the drinking bowls from the 5th to the 8th century. And you see that the physiognomy with these almond-shaped eyes, the same sort of facial expression, moustaches, this is very similar to what we see on the bowls. Now, this, of course, led me in the direction of art history again. Now, what's interesting about these representations is that scholarship has shown that in Sogdiana, this form of representation actually was a way of portraying both manly and feminine beauty. That this particular type of face was considered beautiful in this culture, and that on the faces of men, this was considered particularly the face of the beautiful warrior. So this type of this ideal of beauty in the male sense of the beautiful warrior was embodied in this type of facial representation in Sogdiana. So it's interesting to contrast this with the Byzantine-produced bowls, which, as I said, to a Byzantine audience from a different milieu, as it were, a different cultural background, they would have viewed this quite differently. For them, this is the face of an outsider, a barbarian. So this led me, therefore, back to history and wondering, considering the date of these drinking bowls in the first half of the 7th century, who could this represent? Now, in the late 6th and first half of the 7th century, the most dangerous group or people to the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was a people called the Avars. And on this map, you can see the migrations of the Avars through Eastern Europe and their attacks on the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Avars, we know, came from Central Asia. There's still a lot of debate upon their ethnicity and where exactly they came from. But everyone's agreed that they came from Central Asia. They migrated across Central Asia and the steppe regions. They were nomadic people, and they had a fearsome reputation. When the Byzantines first encountered them in the middle of the 6th century, their appearance was a bit of a shock. And also their warlike nature. They were an aggressive people. Here are some reactions, contemporary reactions in Byzantine sources. Bishop John of Ephesus, who lived in the later 6th century, and that you see at the top of the slide, he called them an abominable people, who from their long hair are called Avars. So these sources, these Byzantine sources, they do refer sometimes to the facial characteristics of the Avars and their dress and appearance, their hair, etc., but often frustratingly not in enough detail for us to say, oh, this corresponds exactly to what the bowls look like. So from this description of John of Ephesus, we can see that they had long hair. The second description from this chronicle of Theophanes Confessor describes the strange race of the so-called Avars who reached Byzantium, and everyone in the city thronged to gaze at them as they had never seen such a people. They wore their hair very long at the back, tied with ribbons and plaited. The rest of their dress was like that of the Huns. Now here, this chronicle is equating the Avars with an earlier nomadic people of the steppe, the Huns. The Byzantines tended to lump all of these people together by reason of their origin and their lifestyle. If they were nomadic and they came from the steppe, well, they were just another one of these peoples, and they tended to lump them stereotypically together. But nonetheless, you can see from these accounts that the Byzantines didn't take kindly to the Avars. These all are very negative quotations about them. They regarded them as, this author, Theophylax Simocatta, wrote, as a most untrustworthy and insatiable nation among those who live as nomads. So you have here some examples of the stereotyping of the barbarian, nomadic, alien to their culture, dressed outlandishly, not like the Byzantines, being warlike, supposedly untrustworthy and greedy and insatiable. And note the long hair. And here we have another very negative account of the Avars in the so-called Strategicon of Maurice from the early 7th century. And this really brings home how much the Byzantines disliked them. They are superstitious, treacherous, foul, faithless, possessed by an innate desire for riches. They are armed with mails, swords, bows, and lances. In combat, most of them are doubly armed, lances slung over their shoulders and holding bows in their hands. They make use of both as need requires. Not only do they wear armor themselves, but in addition, the horses of illustrious men are covered in front with iron or felt. They give special attention to training on horseback. One additional clue as to their appearance is provided by this text by Theodore the Syncellus, and we'll meet him again later. He was a cleric at Constantinople who composed a homily, that is a sermon, on the defeat of the Avars when they besieged Constantinople in the year 626. And this, as we will see, was an important date and is important, I believe, for the interpretation of these bowls. Here, he's describing the leader of the Avars, their ruler or Kagan, and he describes him very negatively as a barbarian savage. He compares him to the Antichrist and to a mythic king who was punished for his impiety and overweening pride. And what's interesting about this quote is he mentions tattoos on his body. So you can see from this quote, the Byzantines had a very negative view of these people who were seen essentially as akin to demons. So what do we know about the Avars and how can we link the bowls with them, seeing as they are contemporary with the period when the Avars are attacking the Byzantine Empire? Well, here I had to turn to archaeology in the former Avaric regions of Hungary. This excavation at a place called Kanbaboni in Hungary produced a superb, an amazing excavation of a very rich tomb, which the excavators identified as that as an Avar Kagan, that is, as one of the ruler of the Avars. And you can see some of the splendid weapons and even imported Byzantine objects that were found in this burial. Now, very interestingly, the excavators also studied the human remains from this burial. Here is the skull, and they attempted a facial reconstruction of this skull. This was a method which had been pioneered in the Soviet Union during the Soviet period. And here you see their reconstruction, which I think you'll agree somewhat resembles our bowls. Now, you have to be careful also about these forensic reconstructions. While on the one hand, they do draw upon obviously scientific data, which we can study the thickness of skin and muscle on the face and therefore reconstruct it, the actual facial appearance, such as things like noses, eye shape, the hair, all of these things tend to be fairly subjective and has been subject to some criticism in scientific and art historical circles. So we have to be careful that we are not projecting, as it were, who we want to see on these facial reconstructions. So while this claims to be a scientific reconstruction, we also have to treat it with some, shall we say, care. More recently, the study of Avaric burials has turned to the study of DNA to try and establish their linkages, which we know historically, to Central Asia. And therefore, I was interested in this as to see if this could help us understand their facial appearance. Now, a very recent study, a German study, studied the ancient DNA of Avaric graves from, as it says here, from the region of Hungary. And this important burial at another place called um, it was a place called Debrești Vicas Dulo, produced again a very rich burial, which could have been one of the princely class of the Avars. And here you see that burial. Study of the DNA did establish, compared with modern populations, that, as this quote says, there was a clear affinity to Northeast Asia, and that the 7th century Avar period elites show 20 to 30% additional non-local ancestry, likely associated with the North Caucasus and Western Asian steppe, which could suggest further migration from the steppe after their arrival in the 7th century. And here you see a facial reconstruction of the skull from this burial. So DNA does suggest that there's definitely Central Asian, Eastern Asian DNA in the Avars. It seems to confirm their point of origin, and therefore it lends, shall we say, weight to the interpretation of these faces, as on this reconstruction, that they do reflect certain Central Asian characteristics of physiognomy, which, as you've said, we do find on these cups. So therefore, it's not a stretch to assume that while these cups are stereotypical representations, they're meant to represent the barbarian in the eyes of the Byzantines, that they could also draw upon life, as it were, that they could draw upon the actual visible appearance of the Avars as literally seen by the Byzantines. There are also one or two additional clues on the bowls. For example, you remember this V-shaped cap or bonnet that appears on this bowl? Well, interestingly enough, in this Kaganic burial from Hungary, there were these V-shaped gold appliques, which were once sewn onto cloth. It seems that these V's were a Avaric symbol. We don't fully understand what their meaning was, but it definitely had meaning in the cosmology of the Avars. So we seem to see it here on the caps. We should also remember the peculiar shape of these bowls. You remember that they are rounded on the bottom and they have single handles. This also links them to Avaric culture. As you see on this slide, we see this is a treasure called the Varap treasure, which was found in Albania. I draw your attention to the numbered bowls on the slide. Notice that these are drinking bowls in silver and gold. Notice that they have they are very much half spheres, like the ceramic bowls and the silver bowl in Washington, and that they have a single flange handle, in this case, attached to their sides. So these definitely provide, as it were, a link to the Byzantine bowls, which I should point out have absolutely no precedent or comparable shape in Byzantine ceramics. These are obviously quite different to all other Byzantine ceramics and silver shapes. Here's a further link that I explored. As these objects were clearly produced in Byzantium, there's no doubt about it, the ceramic drinking bowls and the silver vessel were produced in Byzantium. Clearly, the Byzantines, although they hated these Avaric barbarians, they also had a barbarian-style taste, what I call a barbaricate taste. That is, that they imitated certain cultural aspects of the dress and appearance of these peoples as a way of young people essentially rebelling against their elders. This was particularly true amongst the so-called circus factions in Byzantium. It seems that the unruly circus factions who supported chariot teams in Constantinople tended to dress up in so-called barbarian styles, as this quotation from the historian Procopius explains, that they dressed in the Hunnic fashion, they let their hair grow long, and they tended to dress in clothes in the Hunnic or nomadic steppe fashion. And you can see this also illustrated in these bronzes that show soldiers dressed in barbarian style dress. And I should also add that Eastern nomadic warriors and other outsiders in Byzantium were employed in the imperial army. So that leads us back to our bowls then. I therefore concluded that, yes, one could argue, given the date, the context, the cultural links, the understanding of the cultural historical context of these bowls, that they are of Byzantine manufacture, that they are quite unusual in their shape and decoration for Byzantine pottery and silver and art, and that therefore it is a good argument can be made that they do represent contemporary barbarians, that is the Avars of the time. But I also explored whether they could be linked more closely with particular events. And the outstanding event of the era is the Avar Persian siege of Constantinople in the year 626. In the year 626, the Byzantine capital was surrounded by huge armies of, on the one hand, the Persians from the east, and from the north, the Avars, who were in alliance with them, led by their Kagan. And this map here shows you, I regret it's I think it's in Russian, it's the only one I could find, but you can see that the Avars launched fierce attacks on the city walls. This was, and also by sea. This was really a very dangerous attack on the capital, and but fortunately for the Byzantines, it was repulsed. So this is a particular historical moment when the Avars came very menacingly, literally, to the gates of Constantinople. And certainly the date 626 does fit with the approximate dating of the bowls. So I therefore wondered whether there was a direct link between this event and the bowls, given that they're very exceptional objects, and actually these are the only ones so far recorded. It might suggest that they were produced specifically for a specific event in history. Though in a way, these bowls are, as it were, commemorative souvenirs, perhaps to celebrate the triumph of the Byzantines over their hated enemy, the Avars. The very form of these bowls, imitating Avaric drinking bowls and bearing the faces of the hated enemy, would seem to support this. It's, as it were, appropriating the enemy's culture and essentially turning it into a vehicle of Byzantine propaganda by representing them stereotypically as barbarians. And remember, when you were drinking from these bowls, because of their spherical shape, the face of the barbarian, as it were, would be raised. As you drank from it, it would be raised. And it would even act as a mask, temporarily covering the part of the face of the drinker. But when you put it down on the ground, actually, the face would be, as it were, subordinated and placed in a humiliating position. Also, these bowls, because they were spherical, it would be actually difficult to put them on a table. This therefore encourages the idea that you would drink them like a shot, all right? You would drink them straight down because your drink would spill. And if you hung them on the wall, which was on a hook, let us say, which was probably the best way to hang them up, these would also look like severed heads. So I drew the conclusion that these are, as it were, stereotypical representations of the enemies of the Byzantines, the Avars, and that it is possible that these were created as a sort of souvenir to celebrate their defeat in 626. That literally the Byzantines were using these cups, these drinking bowls, to toast the defeat of the barbarians, hence my title. So I'll conclude with this quotation from Theodore Synkellos, his homily delivered in the great church, the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, after the defeat of the siege in 626. And here he likens the deliverance of the citizens of Constantinople to that of the ancient children of Israel over the Egyptians in the biblical book of Exodus. The archbishop, the general, and a considerable number of townspeople being outside the gate, which we call in accordance with its appearance the Golden Gate, and looking at the fire and smoke of the barbarian siege engines which were burning, raised their hands towards heaven and uttered cries and tears of gratitude. Thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. In the fullness of thy glory, thou hast crushed the adversary. So I'd like to propose that these cups, which started as mute objects, artifacts unearthed in the harbor of Constantinople, lend some light to not only the construction of the Byzantine barbarians, in this case the Avars, but may have been produced to commemorate their defeat and to toast the ending of the barbarian threat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, Eric, thank you so much for that. I just want to give a round of applause. Maybe it'll be virtual, apart from my own. But yeah, that was really fascinating. I guess I'm going to give people a second to collect their thoughts and think of questions that they might like to ask, and maybe I'll pose one to get things started if I could while these questions bubble and boil. I like that we ended on a kind of a possible entry into drunk history.
Yes, drunk history,
Uh,
yes.
Another way of framing the talk. Fascinating to think of the cups hanging on the wall and the way in which people actually drank these drinks, and I'm sure people will have more questions about that. My question is sort of about the one of the themes in your talk and also in the article that you published, um, which has to do with what is at stake in the representation of foreigners. There's a kind of part of your journey, your search is sort of to figure out what kind of contact did they really have and who did they really encounter. And so to what extent is this informed by reality? On the other hand, to what extent is it a kind of stereotypical representation? I think that has a lot of resonance for people in this Zoom today in terms of how foreigners are represented in different historical contexts and what's at stake in those. I wondered if, sort of posing this as a question, because of the images that you showed us of, sorry, of classical, of kind of kind of Roman standards of beauty and Roman representations of barbarians, is one of the arguments at stake here to do with an evolution in the way barbarians are represented in the Byzantine period as opposed to kind of high Roman classical period? Is there some shift that you see in the way this works in terms of the hair or the dress or the representation of the eyes and nose? I just wonder if you could speak a little to that. I was curious about that.
Sure. Yes, you've touched on an important point there, Alex, because as I showed you, Byzantine Roman representations of so-called barbarians tended to be very stereotypical. And as I said, they were mostly designated by the clothes they wore, the facial hair they had, and the attributes, the things that they carried or had. Um, that's how you recognize them. It wasn't through the face, through physiognomy. Uh, the bowls that I illustrated today do demonstrate a change, that they are, demonstrably different from what artistic convention had represented before. And therefore, this is highly intriguing. And therefore, as you say, it raises the question of direct contact. As I said, the Avars did get directly to the gates of Constantinople in 626. and they obviously lots of them died in the course of that siege. They were visible from the walls, and in addition, actually, these Avars had previously visited Constantinople and been seen by the people and on embassies to the imperial court. So there was direct contact between the peoples. So the Byzantines, hence their repulsion at their appearance in these accounts. But yes, the intriguing thing is why this shift in their representation. I'm not sure I have a full answer to that. It's part of it would have to involve a larger study of changing attitudes, perhaps in the 7th century, that maybe we can detect. But it might be, again, in a way to sort of further identify the Avars for the people who are drinking from these cups. That it's not just a generic
好了，我在上课。
people, but it's very specifically the Avars who've just been defeated. By the way, another
我们
thing
学
that
校里面有一个东西，就是让我们要加入。
could you mute, please? Another thing that occurred to me was that these generic faces, while they can stand for all Avars, all right, I wondered if perhaps they were specifically referring to the Kagan, because he, of course, is their leader and was singled out by Theodore Sincellus as being the archetypical barbarian Avar. All right, he's the Antichrist, according to them. So I think the Byzantines would have strongly identified with the imagery on these cups, and maybe that's why they have these very particular features. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to call on people. If you have a question, just put the little hand symbol up, and I'll get to you in the order that your call was received. First, I'd like to call on Professor Emmanuel Emba.
Thank you. Impressive lecture, Professor Ivison.
Thank you,
I have a question here, and you talked about the manufacturing techniques or methods of making, and I was wondering if you ever did try to make any connections or parallels between those cups and the bronze sculptures of Benin, which had similar structures, many of them located at the British Museum.
Do you mean in terms of manufacturing technique?
Yes.
The Benin sculptures are, of course, cast in bronze. They're a very artisanal form of production, and by that I mean that each bronze, as far as we can tell, is a sort of singular production. All right, it's a singular artistic production where they make a mold and pour the bronze in. All right, the cups I showed you are an example of Byzantine mass production, because they were made clearly in molds, which could therefore produce multiple copies, and they were also glazed using lead glaze and slip in the way of mass production of tableware, of ceramics. So while the Benin bronzes are really for elite, one-off, high prestige objects, the cups that I showed you we can regard as mass-produced and for a much bigger audience. So I really think that we're dealing with the cups with the tip of the iceberg, that these are the only examples of yet being discovered, but they're clearly part of a much larger group of a number of these objects, which we're only just now finding out about. By the way, the silver vessel that I showed you at Dumbarton Oaks clearly shows that this is obviously a much more upscale, more prestige artisanal type of production, but that clearly the celebration and the similarities between the cups in ceramic and the silver show that this was being celebrated across the social structure. wealthier elite people were clearly toasting the defeat of the barbarian with similar silver vessels, as people on the lower levels of society were toasting it with much less expensive ceramic ones. Okay, I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, I'd call on Professor Susan Smith-Peter with a question.
Thanks, Professor Ivison. Great talk. Yeah, really enjoyable. I have a couple of smaller questions. One of them is about the Sogdian murals. I thought that was very interesting, and I can see some similarity. And I was wondering, how would the people in Constantinople have been able to see those? I mean, I wonder, did the Avars bring elements of that? Or, I mean, obviously you can't know that for sure, but maybe that was part of what was going on. I think that the question of mass production is really important. I would highlight that more, because that's really interesting to think about, this being made on a large scale. I was wondering, did you come across any descriptions of events that might have been used? These might have been used at, like, you can imagine some sort of banquet where people are toasting, wealthy and poor alike toasting, and that, these things could be sold. I'm just kind of curious. And then just finally, I'll say, have these been studied before? These very specific, the two that you're focusing on, have they been studied before? And so is this all new?
Okay. To answer your fourth question first, no, they haven't been studied before. They've been very briefly, literally illustrated in the catalogues that I showed at the beginning, but nobody has tried to work out what on earth these objects are. All right. And nobody has linked the silver Dumbarton Oaks vessel with these before. Going back to the first question now, these murals in Sogdiana. No, obviously, I mean, these are in a palace in Samarkand, so obviously the Byzantines wouldn't see them. I was just interested in artistic idioms, and obviously artistic idioms can travel. And so since the Sogdians are copying Byzantine coins and other material culture in Sogdiana, I wondered to what extent maybe the Byzantines were copying Sogdian artistic idioms in Byzantium. You can see also this as regards the Byzantines' taste, certain rebellious Byzantines for barbarian culture, all right, with the circus factions. So I was exploring that possibility, but obviously here I was really just exploring this possibility. Again, it would require a much bigger study to try and put flesh on those bones. I think the second point that you made was concerning what events these could have been celebrated at. We know that after the siege was ended, there was great rejoicing in Constantinople. Theodore Syncellus, as I said, gave this homily at the cathedral, which was full of people celebrating, praying, thanking God for their deliverance. So we can imagine, if we hypothesize, speculate, that there must have been some kind of secular celebration as well. So you can imagine, obviously, these are for drinking. And as I said, they're designed that you really can't put your cup down. You've got to drink it. They are designed for, shall we say, drinking parties, hence drunk history, as Alex mentioned. So, we know that there were taverns in Constantinople. People could celebrate at home. And again, this link to the factions. I'm not discounting, by the way, the possibility that these cups were made for or used by members of the factions, given their taste for barbarian style things. I think there was another question you asked, but I can't recall what it was.
Those were all of them. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Great. Can we hear from Leanne? Has a question.
Yeah. Hi. Great lecture. And thank you for that. Something that I definitely needed after the week that I had. But as so I'm both a history and art history major, and one of the like I feel like I've seen similar water jugs or bowls that have faces on them, but I'm curious, are there other civilizations or cultures that inspired that could have inspired these Byzantium jugs, or vice versa, like others that could have inspired like these water bowls inspiring other cultures as well, or civilizations?
Thanks, Leanne. Nice to see you again. These the bowls, the Byzantine bowls, the ceramic ones, the silver ones, as I said, they tend at the moment they tend to be unique in pottery and silver assemblages of the period. There's nothing else like them, even though they're clearly of the same manufacturing tradition, if you see what I mean. In terms of design and decoration, they're unique, which again makes you think, well, this is a singular thing, presumed perhaps for a singular occasion and a singular event to commemorate it. You mentioned other civilizations or periods having bowls or jugs with human faces. This is true. In the ancient Greek period, there were forms of jugs which had human faces on them, but these were some 1,000 years earlier. So there's no evidence that they had any influence upon things. The objects I talked about, which date to 1,000 years later.
Interesting. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Sorry, are there questions? There may be questions I've missed in the chat because there's a sort of mixture of clue and greetings. So if you did put something in the chat and I've missed it, please just raise your hand and I'll give you a shout. Okay, we have we had a hand that disappeared.
Yeah, I think Yorgi was asking a question.
Yeah, but Yorgi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. May I ask the question?
Of course.
Hey, hi, Professor. How are you?
Hi, Yorgi.
So there is a region in the Russian Federation called Dagestan, and they call themselves Avar, even today. Maybe maybe they not call them in a public, but it just sort of they're when they're having a conversation, they call them sort of like a close talk, like when they're friendly with each other, when they see like their friends, they call them Avari, like how are you? So do you see any or at least of your knowledge, any connection between that region Avar and the Avari that we just discussed?
Well, I'm not an expert on Dagestani history, of course. But obviously, I guess it's along the way of the wanderings of the Avaric group. As regards, whether they are actually descendants of Avars, obviously, I really can't say. That would require another study altogether.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a question in the chat from Juliet de Guida. So I'll just read that. I think maybe Juliet doesn't have can't ask it herself. She says to Professor Ivison, if these negative depictions are because of the encounters, why don't you think they depicted Persians in a negative way?
That's a good point. The Persians, Easterners, have been stereotyped by Greco-Roman civilization all the way going back to Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. But they were stereotyped in a slightly different way. While they were stereotyped as being, and I use this term, shall we say, historically, as Oriental, that is, coming from the East, and the Romans and Greeks associated the eastern regions beyond the Mediterranean with despotic monarchies, with regions that had degenerate morals and also lax behavior because of luxury, because of their wealth. These are all negative stereotypes for the Greeks and the Romans. On the other hand, while they called them barbarians, on the other hand, they did recognize that these were, shall we say, people that were much more civilized than the nomadic steppe peoples of the north. So while and also their faces, as you said, they're still represented in a sort of almost classical way. They obviously have beards and long hair, but they're not necessarily dissimilar from the Romans or the Greeks who are opposing them. So there's a slightly different way of representing these Eastern peoples like the Persians, who were a highly civilized, powerful empire to the east of Byzantium that the Byzantines were forced to respect. And they're not on the same, they weren't regarded by the Byzantines on the same, or the Romans on the same, shall we say, negatively cultural level as the Avars were. I hope that answers your question.
So we have another question in chat from M. Lamont, if I'm saying your name correctly. You mentioned the possibility, this is to Professor Ivison, you mentioned the possibility that these styled bowls could have been influenced by barbarian techniques in a kind of countercultural way. Is this compatible with the intention to mock the Avars for their loss after the siege of Constantinople, or do you believe these are two separate theories entirely?
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting one. I don't see these two things as necessarily being mutually exclusive. Clearly, the Byzantines have some experience of Avaric culture, hence the close similarity between the shape of the drinking bowls and the Avaric examples I showed you. So this is a form of sort of cultural appropriation, as it were, being subverted and turned to Byzantine propagandistic purposes. I think you're correct in that this is a way of mocking the Avars. It's a way of it's a way of diffusing their menace and making them into subordinated figures, which is typical for the Roman and Byzantine depiction of barbarians. Barbarians are always depicted on art, as I showed you in my presentation, as submitting to Roman Byzantine military power. All right, so they're always depicted being forced onto their knees or being subjugated in some way. So for the Byzantines, this and the Romans, this was very much a way of depicting their ideological imperial mission, which is the idea of their civilization triumphing over barbarism. I hope that answers your question.
Saralta, who had to leave, had a kind of adjacent point to this. Maybe I'll just bring it up in response to a previous question, which is that one of the things that marked out the difference between barbarians and non-barbarians in the Roman or Byzantine world was sort of settled or non-settled, urban or nomadic. Could you speak to a little bit more in your discussion of these representations, or if that is a factor in them?
Oh, sure. It is a big factor for the Greeks, the Romans, and their descendants, who we call the Byzantines. That the fact that these peoples were nomadic is a huge factor in their labeling as barbarian. The Greeks and the Romans, the Byzantines, civilization was above all represented by settled life, by the city. Remember that the word for city in Latin, civitas, derived from citizen, kives, is the root of our word civilization. So for them, for these people being nomadic, this was an archetypical characteristic of their barbarity. Other characteristics were not only that they were nomadic, but their supposed warlike behaviors, the fact that they didn't live like the Greeks or the Romans. Obviously their hair really attracted comment. And also these stereotypical labelings of their characters, that they are generically untrustworthy, avaricious, cruel, violent by nature. And this connects with ancient Greek ideas of the barbarian, which they inherited, that this was essentially both cultural and, in a way, genetic, according to Greek thinking, that it was inherent in the barbarian by reason of their irrationality by being a barbarian to behave like this, and that this really made them into almost a subhuman kind of creature in Greek, Roman, Byzantine eyes.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more, one or two more questions if we have them. We have maybe one of our last is from Professor Lewis, Mark Lewis.
Hello, thank you, Professor Ivison. I really enjoyed that, especially in your explanation of all the different disciplines and fields that you drew on to make your argument. I wanted to ask if you could give us any insight into how far back the use of severed heads as war trophies go. It's just a general question. I know it was just a small comment you made about possibly hanging these on the wall, but I was just interested in that topic.
Oh, good question. And certainly, I'm not an expert in such trophy taking in the ancient world, but I mean, certainly decapitation and the impalement of the head on a stake has, let's say, a long tradition. Let's put it like that. Yes, I see someone mentions David and Goliath, for example. Thank you for saving me with that reference. And actually, in Roman art, we can see that, for example, the column of Trajan and the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, we can see representations of barbarian prisoners being decapitated. So this was a long tradition. Also, the taking of heads as trophies by so-called barbarians also features in Byzantine writings. For example, a few centuries later, in the year 811, I think it was, the Emperor Nicephorus I was waging war against the Bulgars, who are another Turkic in origin people who the barbarians regarded as dangerous barbarian enemies. He fell in battle to their dreaded leader, Khan Krum, and it is said that the emperor's head was decapitated and then his skull was made into a drinking cup for Khan Krum to drink from at the victory feast. So this is a very sort of gruesome example. We don't know how truthful this is as it comes from a Byzantine source, but it's another interesting sideline on drinking cups and severed heads.
I think Professor Ivison was being too modest when he said that he wasn't an expert in this subject. As it turns out, we had that was quite a good example, I think. I was going to, this is a side remark, Eric, but the Voltaire, who was in his own way a great historian and interested in the classical world in a global sense, in Candide, uses the Bulgars and the Avars, he calls them the Avars, not the Avars, as an example of kind of two armies battling it out in the 7 Years' War And for him, this is a kind of generic example of the cruelty of war that Candide makes his way through on his path to philosophical enlightenment. I just wondered if you'd ever come across these references elsewhere in Voltaire.
No, I haven't. I mean, I'm familiar with Voltaire's essay on historiography in the encyclopedia, but I'm not aware of this appearing in Candide. Thank you.
Are there any other final thoughts, reflections, or questions for Professor Ivison before we conclude?
Oh, has Professor Lewis got a second question?
No,
I'm still here. Thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Mark. I hope I satisfied your answer with the answer.
Christopher has a reflection on the mugs themselves, the faces on the mugs. Christopher Salcione, he says one of the faces looks happy and one looks angry. Do you have a thought on this, Eric?
Hi, Chris. Glad you're here. I'm not so sure they look happy or angry. It's hard to tell from the pursed lips that appear on these bowls. So I just sort of ask us to be, I was dealing with these bowls always the time, reminding myself of caution. It's, as I said, there's always a danger of us projecting onto artifacts what we want to see in them, or how we want to interpret them. I really don't. I think that the lips alone are not enough to argue whether they're happy or sad. In fact, there's a certain passivity to the expressions of these bowls, which again, if anything, which again speaks to their idea of being subjugated. That they are subdued and are no longer a threat. They're no longer snarling or screaming and jumping up and down like the Kagan is made to do in the homily of Theodore Syncellus.
Oh, I'll give the final word to John Dixon.
Thank you, Eric. A real masterclass in exploring, getting as much as we can from these material items. I wanted to follow up on the question that M asked about counterculture, because I was very interested in this sort of idea of barbarian chic or cool, this taste. And was it like I don't know much about the circus faction or the factions, so you'll have to forgive me if this question is completely off target. But are we talking about a real kind of counterculture here when with this taste? And if so, how does that fit with your evidence that this was a mass-produced, or at least a widely marketed drinking bowl? Do those things jar against each other to have a kind of countercultural but also sort of popular item at the same time?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I do think they're countercultural in the sense that they are a form of, shall we say, certainly for the factions, it's a way of them, shall we say, a bit like, say, like Stanley Kubrick's film A Clockwork Orange. They're sort of dressing up in gangs to sort of express themselves as sort of, edgy kind of people by dressing, imitating the garb of outsiders, barbarians. The other thing, though, we do have to consider is that our source, Procopius, is a very conservative source. So he would be rather like, say, a very conservative commentator today saying, oh, young people playing video games, they're going to all end up being violent and they need, this is all wrong, etc. So Procopius is a very conservative commentator, and that comes through in his comments. But it's quite clear that this barbaricate taste, as I called it, this sort of appropriation of and retooling, restyling of barbarian styles was actually quite popular. I mean, I illustrated those bronze figures, for example. So it was more popular than we know, and in fact, the condemnation of Procopius seems to suggest that, as does, as you said, the mass-produced nature of these cups. Also, I think we need to consider if we associate them with the siege of 626, we have to think that the celebration of the defeat of the Avars obviously had a much bigger appeal than just dressing up as edgy gangs like the factions. You know, this was something everybody could celebrate, and everyone would probably recognize the symbolic defeat of the Avars by drinking to their demise.
Thank you.
Great. Well, that nicely fits the time that we have for the talk and questions. So I'd just like to, for everyone that's with us, to just thank Professor Ivison again for that enlightening talk and for his discussion with us afterwards.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention and your questions. Thank you.
And
Thank you, Professor.
For students, make sure to leave your clue number so I can copy it down now. And otherwise, thanks very much again.
Thank you, everybody.